You think you've got a strong stomach? You'd better hope so, because medieval people were out here eating stuff that would have modern chefs dialing 911. Sure, movies show medieval feasts with roast turkey legs and golden goblets of wine, but the real medieval dinner table was basically Fear Factor with worse lighting. No fridges, no food safety rules, no sense of maybe let's not eat this. Medieval cooks worked with mystery meat, moldy bread, and the culinary motto of, if it doesn't move anymore, it's dinner. Survival took priority over flavor, and food hygiene was, well, a medieval myth. Today we're diving fork first into the 5 worst medieval dishes, the kind of gut bombs that would have you begging for a modern microwave burrito. From roasted cats to live birds hidden inside pies, these are meals that make prison food look gourmet. Strap in, because once you hear what made the medieval menu, you'll never whine about soggy fries again. Number 1. Cockantrice. If there was ever a medieval dish that looked straight out of a fever dream, it was the cockantress. Imagine sitting down at a lavish Tudor feast, expecting a nicely roasted capon or a young pig, and instead watching the servants wheel out what looks like a mythical beast, half chicken, half pig, all roasted and gleaming with saffron glaze. Welcome to the bizarre culinary world of the cockentrice. The method behind this monster was as dramatic as its appearance. Medieval cooks would take a suckling pig and a large capon, which is a fattened rooster, carefully split them both in half, and then quite literally stitch the front half of the pig to the back half of the bird, or vice versa. Sometimes they swapped heads, giving you a creature that looked like a barnyard accident in the worst possible sense. Once the sewing was done, the hybrid beast was stuffed with spiced meat or herbs, brushed generously with egg yolk and saffron for that rich golden glow, and finally roasted slowly on a spit until it was ready to horrify the dinner guests. Why go to all this trouble? Well, the cockantrice was a medieval showstopper. Banquets under the Tudors were about more than food. They were about power, pageantry, and spectacle. Serving a pig-chicken chimera covered in gold leaf was a message. We are so wealthy, we can waste time, effort, and money to create something purely for shock value. It was essentially a culinary flex. Medieval chroniclers even wrote admiringly of Cockantress as a marvel of the cook's art, praising the creativity and skill required to pull it off. But if you step back from the display, it's easy to see why this dish also earned a spot among the most horrifying medieval foods. First of all, the taste. Pig and poultry cook at completely different rates and temperatures, which made it nearly impossible to get both halves properly roasted without one turning dry and the other staying dangerously undercooked. Food poisoning? Practically guaranteed, especially in a time with no food thermometers or reliable heat sources. Second, let's talk about hygiene. Remember, we're in the 15th or 16th century. Kitchen floors were covered in straw. Knives might go weeks without proper sharpening or cleaning, and the hands sewing pig to chicken probably hadn't been washed in days. All of this made the cockantrice not just a theatrical dish, but also a bacterial ticking time bomb. Still, medieval diners were nothing if not fearless. For them, the cockantrice wasn't horrifying. It was awesome, a living fantasy made edible. Medieval cookbooks actually preserved the recipe in surprising detail, down to the instructions on how to stitch the halves neatly, as if you were a tailor working with silk instead of raw flesh. They even described how to baste the seams to keep the creature from splitting open while it roasted. As if that weren't theatrical enough, some versions went the extra mile, gilding the whole beast with actual gold leaf. Because if you've just sewn together a pig and a chicken, why not make it shine? The rich yellow from the saffron and egg yolk plus a layer of gold leaf was guaranteed to make guests remember the moment for the rest of their lives, whether they liked it or not. Today, you'll only see cockantrice made by the rare historical reenactor or food historian crazy enough to recreate it. In the modern kitchen, its hazards and absurdity far outweigh the shock factor. But in the days of the Tudors, this stitched-up barnyard monster was the centerpiece of a feast designed to wow and terrify in equal measure. So the next time you complain about dry turkey at a holiday dinner, picture the cockantrice, a Frankenstein's monster of pork and poultry, sizzling on a medieval spit, ready to haunt your dreams, and probably your digestive system, for days. Number 2, roast cat with garlic. Of all the medieval recipes that make modern stomachs churn, few top the notorious roast cat with garlic, a dish that sounds like something out of a nightmare, but was disturbingly quite real. This recipe comes from a 16th century Catalan cookbook, which treated the cat much like a wild rabbit or a hare. It was a harsh reminder that in medieval Europe, hunger could override almost any culinary taboo. The process started with selecting a well-fed house cat. No scrawny alley cat would do. Once the unfortunate feline was slaughtered and skinned, the next instruction reads like a twisted joke. Bury the cat in the ground for 24 hours. Why? Allegedly, this helped remove the unpleasant taste and added a certain earthy aroma to the meat. Whether it worked or not is highly questionable, but that was the recommended first step. After the cat had marinated underground, the cook would dig it back up, dust it off, and get to work on the actual roasting. The meat was slowly cooked over a low flame while being basted generously with garlic-infused oil. Medieval cooks claimed the garlic made the flesh more palatable. Let's be honest, it probably just helped cover up everything else. One of the most bizarre details of this method was the instruction to occasionally whip the roasting cat with a fresh green branch. This supposedly helped tenderize the meat, although it might have been more about superstition than science. Medieval cooking was full of beliefs like that. A branch would somehow soften the meat fibers or drive away any lingering evil from eating a domestic animal. Either way, it's a detail that feels more like folklore than serious culinary technique. Even the medieval author of the recipe seemed to realize how grim this sounded. The book actually suggests discarding the cat's brain, calling it dangerous to eat, and then adds that if you do serve cat, treat it like a rabbit. In other words, hide what it really was and hope your guests didn't ask too many questions. Why would anyone eat cat in the first place? Survival, plain and simple. Medieval Europe, especially during times of famine or war, forced people to get creative or desperate with their protein sources. Cats were available, small enough to catch, and provided a source of meat when there was nothing else. People today might recoil at the idea, but back then, the choice was often between cooking the family cat or starving. Of course, the social stigma of eating cats was strong even in those times. This was a meal of absolute last resort, not a festival centerpiece. In wealthier houses, you'd never see roast cat at the table. This was a dish for the poorest people, scraping by however they could. Over time, the recipe vanished along with the worst famines and the arrival of slightly more reliable food sources. Modern historians see it as a dark chapter in the history of European food culture, a brutal testament to how far medieval society would go to survive. Even in those days, people found the idea unpleasant enough to write disclaimers about the brains and to warn that cat should be eaten as one eats a rabbit, as if to psychologically soften the horror. Today, of course, the very thought of eating a roasted cat basted in garlic is enough to make most people gag. But in the brutal world of 16th century Catalonia, where famine was always one bad harvest away, this dish was a grimly practical, if deeply unsettling reminder that survival often had no rules. Number 3. Porpoise in blood. If there was ever a medieval dish that shows just how far people could stretch the definition of fish, it was porpoise stew, or more accurately, porpoise stewed in its own blood. In medieval Europe, strict religious fasting rules meant meat from land animals was banned on certain days, but fish was fair game. So church authorities classified marine mammals like porpoises, seals, and even whales as fish, making them perfectly acceptable during Lent or other fasts. The porpoise, a small toothed whale related to dolphins, was considered a delicacy among royal and noble households. It was big enough to feed dozens of guests, but rare and expensive enough to signal wealth and status. Medieval cooks would take cuts of its dark, oily meat, which was often compared to beef but fishier and far more pungent, and stew it in red wine, vinegar, onions, breadcrumbs, and a mixture of spices, the pièce de résistance, thickening the sauce with the porpoise's own blood poured back in to enrich the flavor and deepen the color. It was basically medieval surf and turf gone horrifying, and the preparation wasn't exactly gentle. The blood, which could easily go foul if not handled properly, was mixed straight into a hot pot of wine and onions, thickened with bread, and poured over chunks of porpoise flesh. Hygiene was, as usual, somewhere between questionable and non-existent. Medieval cooks didn't fully understand bacteria, and working with blood from a marine mammal that had been sitting on a dock for hours or days was a recipe for, let's just say, more than spiritual enlightenment during Lent. Contemporary descriptions called the dish rich and robust, which is polite medieval language for overpowering. The combination of sour vinegar, heavy spices, and the metallic taste of blood had to do a lot of work to cover up the strong, slightly rancid tang of porpoise meat. The medieval mind might have seen this as a pious meal, but by modern standards, it sounds like a medieval dare. Of course, most ordinary people never got close to a porpoise. This was a high-status dish for royal or noble tables, often served at court feasts with elaborate presentation. Sometimes the cooks even reconstructed the shape of the whole animal, sewing the skin back around the cooked meat before carrying it to the table. The effect was dramatic, but probably horrifying to watch. Imagine seeing a dolphin-like creature arrive on a platter, stitched back together, dripping a sauce made of its own blood, not exactly your local fish fry. Today, the very idea of cooking a porpoise would be illegal, since these animals are protected throughout most of the world. Even among historical food historians, the recipe is rarely recreated because of both conservation ethics and the gut-turning factor. But it tells us something important about the medieval worldview, that religious rules, social status, and creative loopholes could combine to produce a dish that makes modern stomachs turn. So if you ever feel forced to eat fish sticks on a Friday, count your blessings. At least nobody is serving you porpoise in a blood and onion gravy, sewn back into its own skin for dramatic flair. Medieval Europe, as usual, took fish on Friday to terrifying extremes. Number 4. Lamprey Pie. If medieval cuisine had a poster child for luxury gone wrong, it would be lamprey pie. Lampreys are ancient jawless fish that look like something straight out of a nightmare. Think a slimy eel with a circular, toothy sucker for a mouth. Yet for centuries, the European elite adored these creatures, praising their flavor and serving them up at royal banquets like prized delicacies. Lampreys were usually caught in rivers, especially during their upstream migration. Once caught, they were kept alive as long as possible, sometimes transported dozens of miles in barrels of water, to make sure they were fresh for the kitchen. Fresh is a relative word here, though, because the preparation process left a lot to be desired. Medieval cooks would gut the lamprey, boil or bake it with spices, and then pack it inside a pastry crust, turning the whole thing into a pie that looked respectable enough to present at a feast. But this was no steak and kidney pie. Lamprey meat is extremely fatty and rich in oils, with a flavor that was described even back then as intense. For guests unaccustomed to it, lamprey tasted overwhelmingly muddy and fishy, with a greasy, cloying aftertaste. And if you were unlucky enough to get one cooked improperly, you could get violently ill. The blood of lampreys is mildly toxic and had to be carefully removed, a detail medieval chefs sometimes skipped in their rush to serve a prestigious dish. Poisoning guests wasn't exactly a winning move, but it happened. The tradition of eating lamprey was so powerful that English kings made it almost an official symbol of status. King Henry I was famously rumored to have died after gorging on lampreys against his doctor's advice. The doctors weren't worried about cholesterol. They were worried about lamprey blood and spoiled fish. The king ignored them, enjoyed his beloved lamprey pie anyway, and never got up again. For medieval lords, though, the risk was worth it. Serving lamprey pie was a way to flex their wealth and power, especially since these fish were highly seasonal and often hard to catch. The elaborate pies could be decorated with gold leaf or elaborate pastry patterns, making them a centerpiece of any noble feast. Appearance meant everything. If you could afford lamprey pie, you could afford to show off. Still, even many contemporary sources admitted lamprey was an acquired taste at best. Foreign visitors to medieval England often described the dish as revolting, with an odor that clung to the hall long after the plates were cleared. And while the nobility might have seen lamprey pie as the height of sophistication, to the average person, who had little experience with such rich foods, it probably tasted like fish sludge baked in a crust. Today, lamprey is still eaten in a few parts of Europe, but in strictly controlled modern conditions. Medieval lamprey pie, on the other hand, was a risky, oily, and sometimes toxic showpiece, more about status than actual enjoyment. It stood as a perfect symbol of medieval feasting, lavish, dangerous, and guaranteed to make at least one dinner guest regret their life choices. Number 5. The Singing Blackbird Pie. If you've ever sung along to the old nursery rhyme, "Sing a Song of Sixpence," 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie, you might think it's just a silly children's tune, but like a lot of medieval rhymes, it came from a very real, very bizarre piece of food history. The so-called Singing Blackbird Pie was a spectacular banquet prank where cooks baked a hollow pie crust, stuffed it with live birds, and then served it so the birds would burst out, flapping and chirping when the pie was opened. Medieval banquets weren't just about feeding guests, they were about putting on a show. Lords and nobles wanted to dazzle their visitors with surprises, illusions, and even a little chaos. The blackbird pie delivered exactly that. Cooks would first bake an empty pie shell until it was crisp and golden, then lift the top and load it with live blackbirds, starlings, or other small songbirds. Sometimes they'd even tie little ribbons to the birds for extra flair. When the pie was carried into the hall, it looked like an enormous feast dish. But once the lid came off, birds exploded into the rafters, singing and panicking, while the audience gasped in amazement or ducked for cover. It might sound funny, but hygiene was an absolute disaster. Those birds had been crammed into a small, dark pie crust, terrified, flapping, and doing what scared birds do best, leaving droppings everywhere. Between the feathers, the frantic clawing, and the waste, it's hard to imagine anyone wanting to eat from that same table afterward. Medieval sources even describe birds sometimes dying in the hot pastry or being crushed before the big reveal, which made the surprise a little less magical and a lot more grim. Despite the mess, these animated pies became a hallmark of high-class feasts in the 15th and 16th centuries. They were the medieval equivalent of a pyrotechnic finale at a concert, a moment of spectacle and bragging rights. Nobles would hire skilled cooks to design ever more elaborate surprises inside pies, sometimes using frogs, rabbits, or even trained dogs instead of birds. It was theater as much as it was dinner, and showed that for medieval elites, the line between entertainment and cruelty was pretty thin. It's also worth remembering that these banquets took place in echoing castle halls with poor ventilation, where the flapping birds would stir up dust, soot, and all the other delightful medieval smells. Combined with the shock of birds launching themselves at chandeliers and candles, the whole thing was more chaotic than charming. But to the lords and ladies in fine gowns, it was a spectacle worthy of applause. By the 17th century, this odd tradition faded away, partly thanks to evolving attitudes about animal welfare, but probably also because people got tired of cleaning bird droppings off their banquet tables. The rhyme survived, turning the memory of 4 and 20 blackbirds into a harmless children's song instead of a chaotic medieval stunt. Today, the Singing Blackbird Pie is a curious footnote, a reminder that medieval feasts weren't just about feeding guests, but about overwhelming them with drama, shock, and awe. If you ever think modern dinner parties get out of hand, just be glad no one is cutting open a pie and releasing a dozen half-suffocated birds at your head. Medieval people really knew how to party, for better or for worse.